Hey everybody, welcome to Q Plus EDU. We are super excited to have you here this evening. My name is Frederick. My pronouns are they, them. I am Out Youth's Texas Gender and Sexuality Alliance Network Coordinator, and I will be doing the recording for tonight's session, but only the panelists will be recorded, so attendees don't have to worry about privacy issues. And I will pass it over to E.
Hi everyone, I'm E. I use they, them pronouns. I am the founder of Q Plus EDU. I'm here today to moderate this panel and also to moderate the chat and Q&A functions. So if you have any questions throughout this, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A. Also, if there are any resources or anything like that that are mentioned, I'll be dropping those links in the chat, and links to resources will be posted on our website after this. But with that, I'll turn it over to our panelists, and let's start with Greg, if you want to introduce yourself, and if you'd like to share your name, pronouns, and any identities, privileges, or marginalizations that feel meaningful to you. Oh, I think you're muted.
And there, we're starting off well. Okay, hey y'all. My name is Greg Bravo Benetti. I'm a English teacher and diversity coordinator at St. Stephen's Episcopal School in Austin, Texas. And I am a cisgender male, he, him, his, and obviously a white male as well.
Cool. Carson?
Hi everyone, my name is Carson. I identify as non-binary and use they, them pronouns. I was a teacher, public school teacher for 10 years here in Portland, Oregon. Taught everything kindergarten through 6th grade, and am an addict in recovery and now in grad school for counseling.
Hey everyone, I am Sam Davis. I am non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the Assistant Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at St. Andrews here in Austin, Texas. And I'm also in grad school at Texas State here in Texas as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for that. So if we want to jump right in, the first sort of question I have is just generally, what are some ways you can talk about queerness in your classroom, and what are some of your favorite strategies? So whoever would like to go first can do so. Or I can pick someone. Greg, you want to?
Sure. So, you know, as someone who identifies as a gay male, speaking from my perspective and telling my story is just a way that I automatically introduce queerness in the classroom. I'm very open about my husband, my life, and I do it in such a way where it's normalized just like any other identity should be normalized. I'm an English teacher, so I feel like I have a slightly easier job of introducing queer voices in the classroom via text, articles, movies. But that's not to say, I mean, just because I'm an English teacher doesn't mean it's not just as easy to do that in a science class, in what you focus on and who you introduce and what kind of scientists you look at. So really, I think it's quite easy, at least from a historical perspective.
For me, I tend to lean on the community, especially here in Austin. We do a lot of work with Out Youth as well as the Kind Clinic, and using our resources with them and just engaging with our students and getting their input on what they need. We have Spectrum, and then we have the dance that we host with Out Youth that you all put on every year, which we look forward to. But really just looking forward to working with the community and getting their input and just helping us with getting the word out as far as queering our community.
I think for me, similar to Greg, my identity is automatically queering the classroom, and I am open and out about my identity as a queer non-binary person. I also think that you know, authentic stories through kids come up about queer families and LGBT folks, and there's a lot of great resources, especially in the past like 5 to 10 years, of picture books of non-binary kids, of two female parents, of multiple parents, of you know, displaying many different families in many different ways, which I think is super important for kids, because especially in elementary school, they're so open at a young age to to learning and to like redefining what family means, or to adding to their definitions that they already have.
Awesome. And then I guess moving from that, I'm wondering how you present topics related to the LGBTQ plus community to younger students, especially who may not have been exposed to that at home. So are there different ways that you talk about queerness to like a first through third grader as opposed to a high school student? Yeah, you have input on that.
I can start with this because I think that I've worked with the most with younger kids. I don't know exactly how it would be in high school, except for talking about queer identity as it is. I think for elementary students, it's a lot of just like, like I said before, like introducing different family structures and introducing the ideas of love and the different iterations of what love can look like and with who. In terms of gender identity, again, like through picture books, and we talked a little bit about this when we talked as a panel or as a group, and I think we'll probably get into it, but that there's also like authentic opportunities to bring in students' stories and students' experiences without tokenizing them. And when it comes from them, it's so much more authentic, and kids are so much more bought in than like a picture book that doesn't have any context for them. So, yeah.
So like I said before, in terms of bringing queerness into my classroom, just by being there, I feel like I do. But for me, it's, you can talk about queerness in terms of content and queerness in terms of relationality, right? So the content that I'm sharing could have a queer voice in it. And that's really important, but it's also about how do we create a space and a dynamic between teacher and students where there's an open and possibly vulnerable kind of contract between the instructor and the kids. And I think that's super important. And that means from the first day, setting norms, talking about how we talk about identity, really diving into it instead of assuming that kids are all going to have the same competency and the same language. So just by demonstrating, the inclusivity of your classroom space, I think will breed really great conversations about queerness.
I think one thing that we do start out with is we have a class for our freshmen called Habits of Mind. And the first lesson plan that we do is identity molecule, which is a good way to just get students engaged with identifying who they are and then unpacking that with norms of gender identity and then sexual orientation, and then unpacking queerness and then the LGBTQIA plus spectrum in those conversations. But that's a good way to start having those conversations early on. But that's one activity that we start out with.
Awesome. And I think we sort of started touching on this already, but Greg or Sam, either of you, if you want to talk a little bit more about ways that you queer middle and high school classrooms, especially since in those classrooms, students have likely started the process of coming out. You're more likely to encounter students who do identify as queer, as opposed to in an elementary school classroom. So how do you sort of navigate that? And not only teaching about queerness, but also making sure that marginalized students, LGBTQ plus students, feel safe in your classroom.
Sam, do you wanna get that one?
I was going to let you segue it because I got to hang out with you and your kids. And that was a great experience for me.
Yeah, well, so I think it's really important that you have three different constituencies that you have to think about when you're talking about a classroom. You have the students, you have the parents, and you have the administration. And I think there has to be a direct alignment between those three things, right? And typically, we can talk about student discomfort, we can talk about parent discomfort, or we can talk about administrative discomfort. I think the most pernicious of those is administrative, right? You need to have the backing of the people at the head of just the kind of bureaucratic pyramid, right? Because without that backing, you don't want to be kind of a lone wolf in your class. Once you have administrative backing, right, it's really important, I think, just in terms of kids, like I said, is just to be, I'm glad that in high school we can have open and honest conversations, right? I don't know, Carson, bless you for dealing with little kids all the time. My mom is a fourth grade teacher. My sister's a kindergarten teacher, and definitely the strategies that they use to queer their classrooms, right, are very different than mine. So really, to me, it's about making sure that you have the administrative backing that way in case you come across any problems. And then in terms of student kind of awareness, I really tap into my institution's resources in terms of our affinity groups and our clubs, because I think also when you're, the more you can have student interaction and not just coming from you, the more you can bring in other voices, student voices. I think when students hear from each other, they're more apt to listen. And so I think it's really important too.
I would piggyback off the affinity space and having protected time for the students during the school day. I think when they see that that time is held as sacred and valued, they appreciate it more, as it's not looked at as a secret, or it's not a hidden space or something that's not valued overall, as the whole school seeing that, hey, we're taking the time out to acknowledge you for who you are and saying that this is your time, and making sure that other students throughout the school understand that, hey, we see you and we value you as allies, but this is a space for our students who are of the spectrum. So I think if you have that backing of your other students as well as the administration, and having those other teachers who the students can look to for just a safe space to just even drop in, and just if you're having a bad day or you just want to unpack with someone, I think having those three pillars are definitely a good way to get everyone on board collectively.
And we touched on this a little bit, but can you speak more to ways that administrators can be more supportive of teachers who want to queer their classrooms, and of students who are, in these classrooms, in schools in general? What do you need administrators to do to support you?
Show up to some of the engagements. I know for the public school, it's a little bit different than the private school sector, but for any of the policy changes, just showing up in solidarity with the students, coming to the student-led discussion groups if there are any things that are arising and students want to feel heard and need to have their voices heard from people in power. Thinking about what books we're reading in the English department, and thinking about what that is showing our students about what we feel about is considered normal. Thinking about what we're doing overall in our school as far as policies for athletics, our bathrooms, our gymnasiums. Overall, just the small things that we don't think about. What are pronouns listed as far as on our paperwork, in our online portals, our LMSs, our learning management systems. Just those small things that we don't think or we overlook. Those are the things that really matter to the students. But those are some of the things that I really pinpoint and try to look at when I'm doing my work. But those are my main pillars.
I would also, just to kind of add to what Sam's talking about, I think it's really important to have a DEI mission statement. I think the administration actually has to craft something, a living document that others can refer to, right? Because unless it's in the DNA of who you are as an institution, until it's systematized, it can easily change. And so having a DEI mission statement is great. Also, really kind of what Sam said too, just having professional development, right? Making sure that DEI work and queerness are really important, not something you do once every 5 years, but you have professional development around queer issues once a year, because I think that really demonstrates to the faculty your priorities as an institution as well.
Yeah, I want to echo that too about the professional development opportunities, especially like I was going to say, like it helps most when administration remains teachable and willing to learn, which is like a great example to set for everyone in the educational community. But it does start with the administration in terms of the tone. And when getting or looking for professional development opportunities related to gender identity and sexual orientation, going to those folks who have the experience with it, right? Not the people, not straight cis people who are writing about how they can support queer folks. I think allies and advocates are extremely important, and not the first line of resource.
I want to circle back to sort of what happens within the classroom. And how do you navigate the different levels of knowledge between students? So within a classroom, you might have students who are queer and trans, and that's their identity, very experienced in dealing with their own identity. And then you also have students who have never heard of queer people. You have students who have, but they're raised in homophobic families. So how do you navigate that? How do you deal with it when issues arise? And what advice do you have for teachers when trying to deal with those often uncomfortable situations? Sam, I remember you had an answer to this in our planning meeting, if you want to start.
Oh yes, I said that I normally give out content warnings to my queer students when there's going to be a conversation that I feel like they might want to opt out of. But when there is an instance of a microaggression, I try to disrupt it and have a conversation immediately with the class. I feel like sometimes when we're in the moment, we feel uncomfortable and we want to brush things off or try to pull people aside and have a small conversation instead of tackling it collectively as a group. But I feel like in the moment, it's best to have everyone in the room address these conversations because you never want to make anyone feel as if they haven't been seen, and you never want to make anyone or anyone in a party feel as if they have been neglected in the room. But that's just my personal opinion on that.
It's like my DEI director says, silence is violence, right? And so if you don't stop it there, and you're doing kind of irreparable harm, right? Yeah, it's, to me, right, it's about acculturation, and it's about making sure that everyone's on the same page. And that might mean taking a step back before if you're in a science classroom and you're talking about, I don't know, a lesbian chemist, right? To not rush through that part of an identity, but actually take a second to talk to the students about what sexuality is, what human sexuality is, right? It's for me, in my classroom, it's very easy. When I talk about gender, if I make sure that I have designated at least one 45-minute session to talk about gender as a construct before we even get into the content, right? Because you can't expect, you can hold everyone to a high standard, but you have to at least make sure that they have the education for them to understand what that standard is. And I feel like sometimes as teachers, we're so bent on rushing through material, on seeing things as non-essential, as kind of brushed to the side. But really, it's about how you frame an argument and how you acculturate students so that they can be active and good participants in a conversation.
Awesome. I just want to say, Jonathan, I see your question in the Q&A, and we will get to that momentarily. But I wanted to talk about how do you respond to parents who might have a problem with you talking about queerness in your classroom, who might say that it's pushing an agenda. So how do you as a teacher respond to those complaints? And then how can administrators help you navigate those situations?
This is tricky. And my first instinct was to say, like, having had the discussion already with administration, with the, bringing that to light, that might be a topic that comes up, and asking how your administration will support you when and if that happens. I also think for me, it's really helpful, or it was really helpful to have other educators, especially in the same grade level team as I am, also at a meeting with parents who don't identify as queer in any way, who are also validating the importance of queering the classroom, especially in terms of gender identity in elementary school. So it becomes less of like, I'm pushing some sort of agenda, and more of like, this is what we believe is important for kids to know, and it's happening throughout all the 4th and 5th grade classrooms. And this is why.
Yeah, Carson, that's really well put. I mean, the only way that you can deal with parents, in my opinion, is by having the administration draw a line in the sand and say, this is who we are, and these are the decisions we're making. It's not about Greg. It's not about him being gay. It's not about your discomfort, right? This is who we are as a school. And until your school is able to do that, that's when there's really going to be a problem.
Cool. The next question I had is, what is the role of cis and or teacher allies? So that's cisgender and or heterosexual teachers. How can they queer their classrooms, and then how can they support queer teachers in schools?
I think with just a good sense of self-reflection and being aware of who they are and how they show up, and just asking some basic questions like, when did you know like your own sexuality or your own identity, and being able to ask those uncomfortable questions that we have to ask ourselves every day and just challenging themselves. I think that's a good start. I think the allies that I work with show up in ways that when I have moments where I have people who are questioning things that I do, they can challenge them when I'm not in the room, and have that space taken to where I don't have to worry about facilitating those uncomfortable conversations because I know they have my back. Those are the type of allies and co-conspirators that I'm looking for. Those are the qualities that I really hope that people will have for me when I'm not in those spaces. They have my back, basically.
The next thing I had is, do you teach cishet students how to be allies? And if so, how do you do that? Do you think it's just a natural result of talking about queerness in your classroom, or do you talk about allyship specifically? How do you navigate those conversations?
I mean, for my school, we talk definitely about queerness in general, and through that education, hopefully engender allyship, right? But what I think, again, not to put everything on the administration, but there has to be a higher level of engagement. There has to be, we have a chapel system where we go to chapel every day. Allyship needs to be talked about to the entire school community, and therefore it can be practiced in the classroom and strengthened in the classroom, right? We also have a very vibrant GSA, which is again is a great little factory for social justice warriors and allies, right? Because it's exactly what we talk about. But I think allyship can be done individually, but when it's done on a larger scale with more backing, I think it's even more powerful.
Yeah, and I think in elementary school, it's not talked to, like, it's not openly discussed as like, this is allyship and this is what allyship means for different marginalized identities, as far as it is like talking about marginalized identities and how the experiences one person has are not the experiences are of another, and like how can we learn about each other and our own identities and support people who aren't like us, who don't look like us, who believe in different things, who whose families are super different, in the classroom, because we're a classroom community, which I think that I was really fortunate to be able to do pretty successfully, because I had my students for 2 years. So it really helped to have them a 4th grade year and then again as a 5th grade year, because they already knew each other really well, and then could set the tone for the coming in students about like the culture of the classroom and the culture of we take care of each other, and we do stand up for each other, and we don't allow teasing or bullying to happen.
So I see that we've had quite a few questions come in. So I'm going to start with the questions that were submitted via the Google form that was sent out before this. And the first question is, I thought the word queer was offensive and that the term gay should be used if I'm talking about homosexuality. Is the word queer okay for me to use as a heterosexual? So if any of you have input or advice for this person.
Academically speaking, using queer as an adjective and not a noun is completely acceptable in the university setting, which has then trickled kind of down into just general societal acceptance. And so, yes, while it used to be a word that had and still may have negative connotations, it's been co-opted and appropriated in such a way that really, if your intent, you can read someone's intent in how they say it, and usually what noun follows. But queer class, queer folks, queer literature, I believe is completely acceptable for a straight person to say. But it could also be an individualized choice. Carson and Sam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention too that, like, for me, I use the word queer because it does cover several identities that we're talking about. That encompasses gender identity and various sexual orientations. And there are so many different gender identities and so many different sexual orientations that like saying homosexuality is very specific. And that means like one cisgendered person, usually a man or a woman, with, or seeking partnership, romantic partnership with someone of that exact same gender. So queer in the past has been thought of as, or has been a derogatory term. And I do think it's up to the individual as well. I think that queer is more inclusive and covers much more of the umbrella of gender identity spectrum and sexual orientation spectrum.
For me personally, the word queer is liberating and freeing. So I personally, I love using the word queer and identify with it very much so. So I don't think you using the word would be offensive to anyone, but I appreciate the question and I thank you for asking.
In fact, the word that made me kind of have a effective response, in that question, was the word homosexuality, right? More than queer, just because that has so many kind of clinical connotations, where gay versus homosexual, just the gay being so much more accepting. I think queer is also in a similar vein.
I think homosexual comes from like the DSM and psychiatric diagnoses too, which, like, thankfully in 1980, homosexuality was no longer in the DSM-5, but that wasn't that long ago. And so that's a term that we want, like, that I don't want to be near, because I don't want to be identified as someone who has a mental health diagnosis because I identify as loving someone different than who people expect me to love. I also just wanted to add that in terms of queer for me, having come out as non-binary not that long ago, in the past like couple of years, I think queer has been a much easier term for me to use, especially in terms of my own sexual orientation as I explore that, because I don't know, and I no longer have like one of those terms LGB that really describe who I want to love. So queer does a better job of that.
Yeah, definitely agree. I'm also a queer, non-binary student person, and I don't view the word queer when used as an adjective as a slur. Like, I would say in your classroom, don't say the queers or like they're a queer. That's when it becomes derogatory and that's a problem. But it's totally okay to say queer people. Just use it in an adjective sense. It's the same as with like racial designations. It's okay to call people Black. Don't say the Blacks. So just thinking about like using it as an adjective, but also if you just don't feel comfortable referring to people as queer, it's fine to talk about the LGBTQ plus community. I find queer easier to say, but there are also alternatives. But I would definitely agree that homosexual is very limiting and not an accurate descriptor for, I would say, most members of the queer and trans community. But the next question we got was, when I was working as a Spanish college professor, it was easier for me to queer my classroom by assigning and analyzing cultural productions that center on the LGBTQ plus experiences in my upper level Spanish courses. However, now that I will be teaching high school Spanish, I'm a little worried that some of the reading / text / films that I have used in the past are not age appropriate. How do we as educators take into account our students' age in the process of queering our classrooms? I look forward to this discussion. So we touched on that a little more, but do you want to talk about sort of adapting your curriculum based on age, or?
So I was an Italian teacher for many years before I was an English teacher. And honestly, I think language teachers have an easier job than English teachers because all you're doing is producing sentences and you get to choose the subject, object, and verb that are there, right? So if in, thinking about how deeply ingrained heteronormativity is, that it has to be he and she went to the store, have some fun with it. I mean, use examples that reflect the real world and the intersectional world in which we live. And therefore, like, you can teach gender through grammar. I'm a huge geek, and that just made me so excited, right? So I think there's, just because you can't talk about like water for chocolate in an elementary class, doesn't mean you can't have a lot of fun with the examples. Same thing for math teachers. I remember sweating thinking about them right now, but those long word problems, have some fun and mix it up, right? And that's a really great kind of way to show how inclusive your space is.
I just wanted to share that someone who's participating in our panel or who's here also said that there are definitely age-appropriate materials for the Spanish classroom and gave a couple of resources, the Times Educational Supplement, and mentioned that gender identity is a topic on the Spanish A-levels in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, so there are definitely resources out there if you're just looking for ways to integrate queerness. Definitely do a Google search for just like how to talk about queer things in your math classroom or your science classroom. And there are going to be a lot of forums and other people who are looking for the same thing. So if you're feeling stuck, that's definitely an option.
I also just too want to reiterate that talking about sexual orientation is very different than talking about sex. And that's something that gets really muddy to some folks who maybe are not so used to talking about sexual orientation and just having an assumed understanding of what sexual orientation means and does. But feeling attracted or feeling drawn to someone of the same gender than you or someone other than the whatever the opposite is or whatever isn't talking about sex. So even in an elementary classroom, talking about lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks is something that they understand and comprehend and isn't inappropriate. We're not talking about sex.
And I just wanted to uplift Frederick's comment in the chat that says, yeah, Jose and William can definitely get a mortgage in math class. And that's true. Like, you can talk about, same gender married couples. You can, get really creative with your word problems. But I wanted to bring up the next question, which is from the Q&A. And it says, I'm an upper school Spanish teacher at a private school in Baltimore. How important is it to take into account intersectionality when we queer the classroom? Being queer will look different depending on your sociocultural background. One thing I struggled with when I was in high school as a queer Latinx who had just migrated to this country was to identify with or relate to a white-centric queer identity, which was what I had access to. And before you all answer, I'm dropping a link in the chat to a panel that we're hosting. It's called Decentering Whiteness and Queerness, and it's on August 28th at 6 p.m. So if you want to learn more about how queerness doesn't have to be white, definitely encourage you to come to that. But if any of our panelists have a response to that, intersectional approaches to queerness in your classroom.
I mean, I think that's critical, is talking about the intersectionality. I think that all of us here would agree that we, just us, we embody different identities, and as and it even sounds like in the question that you're asking that you didn't experience like accepting intersectionality in your experience, and how detrimental that might have been for you. So I think thinking about and taking into account intersectionality when queering the classroom goes way beyond what the characters of Rent are doing, or like what Queer Eye for the Straight Guy is. Like there's so much more.
And especially for all the English teachers out there, if you teach hyper contemporary fiction around identity and queerness, it's always going to be intersectional, always. I mean, really, you can't escape it. And so teaching hyper contemporary stuff is also usually a great way of making sure you're not telling just one story.
I would also suggest getting a book. It's called Queering the Color Line. It's a pretty awesome book. It's a really informative. But the intersectionality, it's really important. I mean, I'm Black, I'm non-binary, I'm queer, and sometimes growing up, I didn't really have anyone to look to as far as seeing myself being reflected until I got older. But I understand how you feel. Oh, thank you for putting the link in there, E. I appreciate that. But yeah, it can be a struggle. That's what I can say. It definitely can be a struggle, but there are so many resources now that you can utilize, and so many books, and so many YouTube TED Talks that you can utilize and share out. So definitely just do your research.
Yeah. So
I
our
want
next question.
Sorry.
Okay.
Can I just drop into the chat too? I don't know if you all have listened to the TED Talk or the YouTube talk that Chimamanda Ngozi, I don't want to say it as correctly as I can, Ngozi Adichie has about the danger of a single story. I think that that's a really powerful video and has been watched in our professional development in a public school before the school year starts. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat.
Carson, you read my, I was just about to say that exact same TED Talk. So say Wavelength.
Yep. Great minds think alike. Yeah, so while Carson's looking that up, the next question is, if you have this DEI statement at one school, have any of your respective school districts made this effort to include queer and trans representation in their district statements so that there's a school district approach and your school doesn't stand alone in this effort? So I know Greg and Sam are both in private schools. If you can speak to any of that, that would be great. I can talk a little bit about districts. I don't know a ton, but.
I think I could say we kind of team up in our efforts to do collaborative work together to make sure that our students are feeling seen and heard and throwing conferences. But as far as other schools, I'm not really sure what they're doing, but I know that we are trying to be as inclusive as possible. We have Spectrum on our campus for our LGBTQIA plus students, and Greg runs a wonderful program at St. Stephen's with his students, and they are very active in the community. I just love what you do there. So yeah, we're trying to stay inclusive and on top of things.
I mean, given that I teach at an independent school, I really can't speak to districts per se, but I do know that there's a desire out there for collaboration, even between public and private schools. There are multiple dialogues and conversations about sharing resources and knowledge. So if that's any indication, there may just be a kind of partnership waiting to happen, but I really can't speak about school districts specifically.
I also feel weird talking about where I live because there are administrative directives in the district in which I taught. But again, I live in Portland, Oregon, and I recognize that that is a very different place than Central Texas. But there are administrative directives, especially around gender identity and transgender and gender nonconforming students, and referring to them by their preferred pronouns and providing safe spaces for them to use the restroom and more.
Can I just jump in for a second? Carson, you just said something that made me think of a helpful thing in terms of pronouns and administration. It's really important in terms of open communication when you have a change of pronoun with a student, that someone is there, you have some kind of coordinator that will then therefore disseminate that knowledge to the rest of the faculty. So therefore it's not the person telling every single time that they've had a pronoun change. That's just like a simple thing that can be done in a school to make it so much more inclusive, where the onus isn't on the student to explain their identity, but just have the faculty accept it, behind the scenes. I always say like diversity work should be like a duck in a pond. Like when kids see us, They should just see like this placid animal on the water. They should not be seeing our feet going at 200 miles per hour underneath, right? And so just that might be one really easy way of making sure your institution is a little bit more inclusive.
And I think also that just reminded me, in terms of supporting especially trans and non-binary students in your schools, it's really important to have a policy set in place for like name changes, pronoun changes, gender marker changes, anything like that. Because I know in my school district, it's often like a student contacts the registrar and then the registrar doesn't know the answer and then they have to contact the district and it's a whole thing. So having policies in place is something that administrations can do to make sure, again, like systematizing things is really important. And so making sure you have systems in place to support trans and non-binary students. And I also wanted to just say in terms of the district things, I think if there's a way that you can advocate for DEI statements and inclusive policies at a district level, that's definitely really important. Because especially in the public school system, you know, it's very hierarchical. You have to obey your state's laws as they relate to education, and then you have to follow the district policy. And so what one school does might be really limited, especially if the district isn't supportive of LGBTQ plus students. So I just wanted to emphasize that like advocacy at the district level is super important.
I'd also echo that advocacy from the parent level is by far the most powerful. As a teacher, I unfortunately don't have that much power within my district. I can scream until my face is blue, and yet I'm just one teacher in a sea of other teachers. But when it comes from kids, and then especially comes from parents, especially parent allies and advocates of creating inclusive and supportive and affirming policies for these students specifically, and how that benefits every student in a school or in a school district.
Yeah, and there are links in the chat to 2 other Q Plus EDU sessions. So there's one, I know the recording is up for Know Your Rights trivia, and it's just about LGBTQ plus students' rights in schools. And so that's a really good resource if there are any students watching this and you want to know more about what your rights are, especially as it comes to being a queer student, you know, what schools are required to support you in and how you can find that support. I also put a link to our panel that was called LGBTQIA plus students need parents as allies too. And that recording is not up yet, but there's a really great list of resources and the recording should be up in the next few days. And so that panel was just about how important parent allies are in terms of education advocacy. So yes, Carson, definitely agree with that. The next question I have in the Q&A, I know there were a couple in the chat as well, and I will come back to those. But in the Q&A, this one says, how do you define or explain the word queer to your students, parents, and coworkers?
There's a great graphic as queer as an umbrella, literally. I don't have access to it right now, but I'm sure that if I Googled it in a second that it could come up. But when talking about queer, using it as an umbrella term, as a term that encompasses many different identities and orientations, is how I explain it. And again, like remembering that I'm not talking about sex, I'm talking about identities, and identities are really different and a crucial part of who you are. I mean, we could argue that sex is too, but like that's a whole nother story that we're not going to go to, but like we all got here some way. But yeah, it's pretty, I don't know, I'll look for it and I will drop a link in, but that's how I explain it.
I mean, I think we kind of touched on this question earlier, so I don't want to repeat, you know, the great stuff that Carson and Sam said. But I think as we move into 2020, 2021, we realize that like identity is complicated and boxes aren't easy. You can't just check a box and pigeonhole someone into a certain kind of identity. And that complication breeds, I don't know, a little bit of ignorance and a little bit of fear, but really identity is so fluid that it's impossible to label it, right? Queerness is just a way of of being in line with the times and being in line with that fluidity to embrace all different tags, all different identifiers, right? Rather than try to continually create a new letter on the acronym until it becomes unwieldy.
Cool. That's all the questions from the Q&A. Again, all of our audience members can feel free to continue asking questions. But there was one in the chat that says, if I can find it, yes, since students at these young ages, and no doubt some older people, are inquiring, what do you do to make sure that gender isn't simply typed into pigeonholes and becomes a label, since they're still growing up? So I guess sort of speaking to how you teach gender fluidity to children.
I mean, they are the best teachers of this themselves. Like, I don't need to teach them anything about this. If anything, I need to like help uncover some teaching that they may have experienced, like through watching TV or through what other adults may have said or done. But in terms of especially gender expression, like kids are the experts in that themselves. I mean, ask particularly like for cis girls, but like I think it's becoming more and more common to hopefully, and more accepting of a place for cis boys to play with gender, because that's is what it is. I mean, that's how we figure out who we are, is by playing, right? And that kids play best. And I think by having opportunities for kids to explore who they are, whether it's writing or art, or talking to peers or talking to small groups, they will do that much better than I ever will.
Absolutely. I'll put up the genderbread person and they'll look at me like this is so outdated. They're like, I've learned this in 4th grade. So I think it's totally to the point. It's more useful for the adults in the room and the admin team compared to the students, actually.
Which makes it doubly important for that group to understand, right? It's not that we're trying to teach everyone, we're trying to bring the knowledge that our kids already have to the people that are molding and helping them grow and teaching them, right? And so it's kind of a necessary impetus more than a gay agenda.
Just dropped a link to the genderbread person in the chat in case anyone would like to see. I think that is all of the questions that folks have submitted. Again, if any of you have other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A. But as you do that, I guess, to our panelists, do you have any final ideas or pieces of wisdom that you'd like to share?
I do, but I'm looking for it. I was a faculty advisor for a queer straight alliance, and the K-8 that I worked in, it was a middle school queer straight alliance, and we had someone from a local youth resource center, sexual minority youth resource center, come and talk to us about the spectrums of gender and sexual orientation, and using Gumby as like I don't know, a visual image of like how it is fluid and how it depends. And I think that was really helpful for me. And I also heard like a lot of echoes from the middle schoolers being like, oh yeah, like this really shows in a way that I understand how this is fluid, and how I don't have to pigeonhole who I am today and set that for the rest of my life, and that it changes, and that's part of being human.
I would just kind of circle back and reiterate the importance of affinity spaces at your institution. I hope everyone knows what an affinity space is in terms with the participants, right? But in that you have a space that's where people who identify as LGBTQ queer folks can come, and only they can come to share their experiences with a faculty advisor who is also queer. That has done that has been the most fulfilling thing I think I've ever done as an educator. Meeting with kids on Friday mornings for like 45 minutes. Usually we don't even talk about being queer. We just talk about life and Netflix, but not having to explain yourself. I don't know. It's an invaluable resource. And I think it does really change kids' lives. So I'm seeing if your administration will allow you to kind of carve out that space. I just think it's so important. I can't emphasize how important it is.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and it reminds me of like all of the harmful desegregation, like busing uh, experiences that we had, and trying to separate people who had similar identities, separate Black folks, who had similar identities, and to like disperse them. When really, like, people want to be with people that they can relate to, and that they feel safe around, and that they don't have to explain who they are. Or defend who they are in any way. So I think affinity groups, no matter what the age, whether it's, elementary school, middle school, high school, or college, or even after college, I'm in affinity groups now, and I'm really grateful that I am.
I would just say listen to your students, get their feedback and their input for sure, and just be mindful of how you show up to them every day. And check your policies, be aware of your bathroom policies, your athletic policies, and just, as always, be mindful.
One last point that I would like to make is about making mistakes with pronouns. And I just wanted to say, like, we all make mistakes with pronouns. I do it all the time. And modeling that it's a simple oops, or like, oh, I messed up. I'm sorry. I'm going to practice getting it right now, instead of apologizing and trying to get the affirmation from whoever the person is that you made the mistake about, because it's not that person's job to make you feel better that you made the mistake. So getting good at making mistakes and then moving on and trying better next time is really important.
Sorry, last thing. Also, Carson, you made me realize there's an easy way to queer your classroom. On the first day of school, say your name and your pronouns. I mean, that immediately queers your classroom.
I just wanted to jump in. Y'all are amazing and inspiring and make me want to be a teacher, but not. But there's a couple of things. Carson talking about like getting comfortable with pronouns. If you are someone who cares to get people's pronouns right, practice on your own before you run into someone who uses ze, her pronouns or they, them pronouns. Use non-standard pronouns for your pets and your plants in private where nobody's feelings are going to get hurt. And if you misgender your plant, it will be fine. And you just keep practicing until you get it right. I also wanted to go back to the question about policies at the district level. So E, if you will drop the link for Stories and Numbers. The Stories and Numbers Collaborative did a bunch of research about what is most important for making classrooms safe for all students. And one of the biggest things is having comprehensive and inclusive anti-harassment and anti-bullying policies. So most, I won't say all, but most districts in Texas at least have anti-discrimination and anti-bullying policies that at least cover sexual orientation. There are some that also cover gender, but not necessarily gender expression and gender identity. And so it depends on how your policies are written. But most districts have some kind of policy like that. And so if your district has that kind of umbrella policy, you can use that to build on and add pressure, and especially if you have parents on your side. That was, and then there was something else, but I don't remember what it was. Oh, I remember. If you're in Texas and you have a GSA and you have questions about it, or you want to start a GSA in your school, reach out to me. That's what I do.
Cool. Yeah, there are a bunch of links in the chat now. If you also look at the pronouns to policy change, link that's in the chat, there are a lot of resources under that. And that includes some resources on like a sample form that you can send out to your students that allows you to collect their name and pronouns. For example, it includes a spot for what pronouns you want them to use, or sorry, what pronouns they want you to use for them in front of the class versus in front of the parents versus in one-on-one conversations, which is something that's important to consider, especially for students for whom it's not safe for them to be out in all spaces. Definitely making sure that safety of your students is your first priority. So that's another great resource if you just want to scroll through our long list of links. There's also a recording of that panel there. But I also wanted to plug our next panel called Understanding Minority Stress, and it is on Monday. And yeah, it's about how marginalization impacts people and the stress it places on them. Oh, someone in the Q&A did say, how can we contact members of the panel? So if any of you are comfortable sharing your contact information, you can put that in the chat, and then I will also put whatever you share in the description of this on our website alongside all of the resources.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It's been super, super wonderful and necessary, and I hope that our audience members got as much out of it as I did. Yeah, we're really grateful that you decided to spend your time with us at Q+ EDU.
Awesome. Yes, so those email addresses are in the chat. But yeah, thank you all so much. This has been great and super informative. I hope all of our attendees learned something today. And as I said, I hope you'll join us on Monday for our next session called Understanding Minority Stress. Cool, but with that, we're gonna close it out.
We do.
Oh, fill out our feedback form. We have a feedback form on our website. I always forget about something. I will pull the link to that now. But yeah, we always love to hear what you thought about any of our presentations that you attend, including this one. So we have a feedback form. Yes. Yes, feel free to fill this out. Cool.
Awesome. Thank you all again so much. We hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.